Welcome everybody to Intro to Animation. Today we've got a lot of cool stuff to cover, and we're going to jump right into it. A quick thing for anybody watching later is you don't necessarily need to follow along for this class. There is a project file to download. It's got some stuff in there to make your life easier, but it's not necessary to follow along. If you want to do hotkeys or something at the same time, that's fine. But other than that, I'd recommend just kind of absorbing and then come up with interesting questions and thoughts from there. All right, today we've got a lot of stuff to cover. We are going to start off by pretty much seeing what the Unreal to Maya switch is going to be like. We're going to have some different things to discuss for what you might be used to in Maya and how that's going to work in Unreal. Some different things about how animation is set up here that will be familiar, and other things that are going to be unique and, interestingly, more powerful. We are also going to talk about the characters that are quote unquote recommended for the fellowship. You don't have to use these characters, obviously. Anything on the marketplace is free game. But 5.2 has a lot of new features, and the characters that we have that I'll be showing you here are going to leverage them the most natively, most easily. And we'll dive into some other stuff as well. A lot of hotkeys. We'll touch on a few things that we've already kind of mentioned I want to reinforce. And we'll also preview some stuff for future classes. But we will also take some breaks after each section here. But with that, I think we just jump right in. If you are coming from Maya, some might be using Blender, Cinema, who knows? But most animators especially are going to be coming from Maya. And there's definitely a difference in terms of real-time versus non-real-time technologies and tools you might be used to. The real-time versus timeline thing is pretty apparent once you jump into Unreal for the first time and you realize that there's no timeline, because that's uncommon to most animation software. You kind of need control over time and frames and things like that. And going into Unreal for the first time, not that it's probably your first time, but going into Unreal in general, by default, there is no timeline. And so that's going to come with some different workflows, and it's also going to come with some interesting benefits that we'll get to later. Another difference is assets. You might be used to character rigs in the sense of having a rigged, skinned model. And it is one asset, you reference it in, and you start working with it. And the thing that is different, the biggest thing I'd say is different, is that your character rig, the skeleton and the bones, well, the character rig usually is controls for animators. That's different from the skeleton and the bones. They are separate entities. Control rig and your skeletal mesh, they're separate, they're independent things, and they can be broken, changed, separated. You can have multiple rigs on the same character. There's actually a lot of really interesting differences when it comes to the assets, which we'll dive into. And then just to retouch on this again, you've heard this before, but for animation, this is super important, that Z is the up axis in Unreal. So if you're used to doing anything going up in Y, it's different. If you're in Blender, this is not new to you. And the last thing is playblasting versus rendering. Inside of Maya, you typically playblast your animation pretty frequently because you want to see what it looks like at actual playback speed, because it's not always one-to-one. Typically, when you work in your viewport, especially the more advanced character rigs you have, you're not usually looking at full 24 FPS at your work, so you have to playblast to see if it actually is what you expect it to be. You are typically going to get that in viewport inside of Unreal, but if you do want to export your work, if you do want to still playblast, you just render. It's just as fast, if not faster, depending on what you're doing to render at this point. And then the last thing I want you to keep in mind is that things just look a lot cooler when you're animating in Unreal. With that, let's dive into a little bit about how animation data is going to work inside of Unreal. There are three major workflows of how you might work with animation data. The first one is keyframe animation. For any character animation people watching, this is your traditional, just set a key, pose your character, move from there. This is where I'm going to focus most of my time today because this is the new stuff. Motion capture has been around for a while, and we are going to cover some stuff in this class for motion capture as well. But I'm going to focus mostly on keyframe because that's what Control Rig helps us to accomplish a lot in a really powerful way. There's also input animation and blueprints and some really cool procedural systems that you could set up. For example, if you wanted to take a controller and attach that, connect it through blueprints to a metahuman's face or something, you could puppet the face using a controller, which I'm not going to show you how to do, but it's a thing that can be done. So before we jump right into Unreal, the last thing I want to kind of touch on is the idea of a skeleton mesh, because it's important we understand exactly how this asset works. Your character is going to come in several pieces in Unreal. It's not just a referenced asset, there it is, rigged character, everything's in there. It is broken out into different pieces, and depending on the level of complexity, you might have more or less pieces. So metahumans are going to have more pieces, these mannequins are going to have slightly less. Well, I wouldn't say less, I can show you. When you go into your project, this is the project that I've shared on the Smashcut resource. If I go into, in here I have content, and then I've got a variety of things. We've got some control rig stuff, we've got a metahuman, and we have starter content and some weapons from the Lyra pack. So everything in this project is free. You can grab it off in the marketplace, but I've just consolidated it in here for your convenience. But if I go to the control rig, characters, and mannequins, you'll notice that there are, obviously things are broken out into several pieces. If I go to the meshes section, you can see we have skeletons and we have skeletal meshes. We also have data assets, which we're going to ignore. And then there's a rig folder where there's blueprints and control rigs and things like that. If I stick with the meshes folder and we open up the Quinn skeletal mesh, here's what we get. The skeletal mesh asset or actor, or however you'd like to define it, it has some stuff once you double click and you open it up. And that's what this slide is meant to show us, is that there are these different editors. These are the names of each of these buttons at the top right corner of that interface. You have your skeleton editor, your skeletal mesh editor, your animation sequences, animation blueprint, and physics asset. And the skeleton editor, this is a really handy area to sort of, in the case of animators, we won't be using this all that much, but there are a few things depending on the workflow that you're using. You might need to come in here, add a socket, mess with skeleton compatibility. Just depending on what you're doing, you'll want to know where these buttons are. But if you don't want to work with this stuff, you don't have to necessarily. I do want to point out that if you're in this window, you might not see the skeleton joints and bones by default. That's going to live inside of character, bones, and then there's a little thing here that says all hierarchy. I think by default it's selected or something. So if I don't have anything selected, they won't show up. But if you want to see them, there you go. So that is your skeleton editor. Your skeletal mesh area is similar. You can actually access the skeleton tree from here as well. But these are used for different things. And then you've got stuff for materials and things like that, so you can isolate your materials, mess with that. You have your animation sequences, which I'm not going to dive into here. We'll show that in practice using Sequencer. And you've got your blueprints, which again, just so you can see it. And then the last one's fun is physics. This is where you can set up collisions for your character. And if you wanted to have an animation where they get hit by something and they ragdoll away, you'd want to make sure that they have all this set up so that you can do that properly. And so, yep. If now what we'll do is we'll start going through a tour of the characters. So these are the, again, quote unquote, recommended characters. You can use whatever, again, but these are the ones that I'm going to point out and say, these ones work really well for everything we're about to do, and things are going to work really simply. So I want to kind of show you some of the best things, which, just to reinforce something we learned in the Sequencer class, if you remember the conversation about spawnables and possessables, you'll notice that this main scene has nothing in it. And if I go back to my content folder, I actually have a level sequence in here called group photo. If you open that up, group photo, suddenly we're in the same level and we have a couple of characters. And this is that photo from the slide. Ooh, so cool. I just want to point this out in case you do use this project file, because if I close the sequencer, they go away. Spawnables, how handy. Anyways, I want to actually show you how those character actors work and some different things to know about them. So let's start with the box. The box is the most, let's say, straightforward to animate because you don't have arms and legs and FK and IK and you don't have all that stuff to worry about. It is a lot simpler to not have to do a whole character. There's a reason that most animation schools start with bouncing balls and things like that. But there's a lot of really rich control inside of this asset that you may not expect. And so there's some really cool features that Unreal has that we can kind of dive into by taking a look at this. If I jump back over, let's pull the box in. If I go to Control Rig, so if you download the Control Rig pack, you'll have this folder, Control Rig, Characters and Props. You'll look in Characters and you won't see a box, but in Props, Card Box, that's where you'll find it. And what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and just drop in our skeletal mesh. There's all these different things: Control Rig, Physics Asset, Skeleton. You want the skeletal mesh. So if you bring the skeletal mesh in, that is typically your kind of base for your characters, your skeletal mesh. Now in this case, when you drop the box in here, it's just a box, which is pretty much always the case. You can't do anything with it until it's in Sequencer, right? If you want to animate it, it's got to go in Sequencer, which is jumping ahead a little bit, but we'll get there. So if we add a new level sequence, so there's I think you can do it through, obviously you can do it through the content browser. You can create level sequences here. I also just like to use this little slate button, add level sequence. And I'll just call this rig tour. We're going to take a tour of the rigs. So if I take this cardboard box and throw it in here, you'll notice nothing happens, which is different than some other characters. If I were to also pull the Control Rig, Characters, and Mannequin in here, go to Meshes and say Skeletal Mesh for Manny. Come on in. The more the merrier. If I bring Manny into the sequencer, his Control Rig immediately pops up. So why didn't that happen for the box? Well, some characters don't have this. I think Bungee Man and the box in particular, they may not just give you a Control Rig right off the bat. So let me show you how to activate one that does exist. Because if you go back to where the box lives, which was in the props folder, he does have one. It does exist. So how do we get it? First, I'm going to go ahead and remove Manny because we don't need you right now, bud. Thanks for playing. With this box in the sequencer, because that's the first thing you have to do, if I go ahead and just say, hey, I would like to add something to my cardboard box, a control rig, I can go to asset-based control rigs, and any relevant control rig that's been created for this character will appear here. And in some cases, you'll see later, there are more than one that you might have to choose from, which is cool. But if I go ahead and just add that from here, we're good to go. Interestingly enough, if I now delete this and say, okay, well, let's take him out of sequencer, goodbye. If I grab him and pull him back into sequencer, it didn't do it this time. Sometimes it will remember that preference and it will give it to you again. In this case, it didn't. That's okay. It's very quick and easy, as you can see. I'm sure later on I'll do it again and it'll work. So you'll see, one way or another. Either way, it's pretty good to pretty simple to get that going. Okay. So I mentioned that it's simple, and it is. And I'm not going to spend too much time playing with the rigs, but I do want to just point out a few important things. Typically when animating a character, you are really not supposed to animate certain controls, depending on your workflow. To be more specific, if I go ahead and bring Manny back in here, I've changed my mind. I do want you here. Join the party. Usually, it is recommended that you get rid of that selection. Here we go. Typically, you don't want to animate the master control. You want that staying in place because the player is in charge of that. Or in film, it's a layout control, and you want to animate the character through space using the actual IK controls and stuff. Usually, basically what I'm saying is, usually if you're like, I'm going to have my character walk, don't do this. It's very rare that you're doing that in a typical animation workflow. With this box character, though, that's a little bit different. You can still not use it, and you can say, oh, well, you know, judging by how I would do my normal characters, my bipedal characters, I would want to move this around, right? Well, there is a really cool feature built into this rig that is going to argue with that sensibility. If you see this big green one, it's not always there. I click all these different controls. I guess I could just quickly show you that, there's various things in here to animate the box flaps and things like that, all fun stuff. There's, things on here to give you some overlap and pose your box a little bit more specifically. There's also squash and stretch, which if I grab this little red one in the middle, you can mess with this. I can stretch it out and in. It's got some good volume controls built in. But the thing I want to show you is if I grab the middle control, this is the one that positions the box. And yes, you could just do this, but you'd be missing out on something very, very powerful called proxy controls. Proxy controls are something that gets set up in the control rig building process. Animators don't make them, but you sure as heck get to use them. If you want to have this box tilt up on its side, you could do that. You could rotate it, and then you could translate it, and you could try to make it seem like it tilted on its edge. But why do that when you have proxy controls? This green thing's really cool. It will automatically give you all of that. And it works for the boxes, for the box edges. It works for the flaps, regardless of where they are. Let me zoom out a little bit so you can see this. I want to have this roll, boop, boop, boop. There you go. And so if I were to close the lid a little bit more, this might be a little bit easier to show. A smooth thing here. If I go like that. So if you grab that middle one, and then I take the green one that appears, whee, there it goes. And what's cool about this is it is for your convenience as the animator, but your animation data does not go onto the little green proxy control. The transformation data actually goes onto the main yellow thing that you would be expecting it to. So all of your curve editor stuff is going to work the way you'd expect. All the data ends up going on the main control. So it's sort of like a magic temp pivot that is smartly looking at the edges of the rig because it was set up that way. Not the rig necessarily, but you know what I mean. And so this is what a proxy control can do. And this is a wonderful example of why we like them. And so if you ever have someone making you a control rig, tell them you want this. There it goes. And this is one of the reasons that I recommend this rig for anyone who's newer to animation, is because it does a lot of that cool stuff for you that's going to look really good, and you don't have to do as much. And since you have the squash and stretch, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with it. As I put here, great for first-time keyframe animators. And just to go over that one more time, to get the green thing, to see the green thing, if you don't see it, you need to grab the yellow control. I think you can actually grab you grab the yellow ring around the character's waist, around the box's waist. That's what that control is linked to. That's what it's actually piloting, and that's how you're going to access it. And then all you have to do is rotate it. You don't have to translate. And I guess I should actually point out as well, if you were actually let me do this. Bring this back up, cardboard, transform, goodbye. I'm going to delete the control rig right out from under this asset and just add a new one. And you can see how quickly I just got rid of everything I already had. If I had a bunch of animation data and I didn't like it, I can just blow it all away by deleting the whole control rig. The green thing is called a proxy control. And if I want to use it properly, that's where you actually do want to use this base yellow control. Because if I say, oh, well, let's go ahead and like move this into the air, and then I want to have it spin, you'll notice that it still moves as if it's on the ground. Because we're kind of in the space of this yellow thing. So if I want to have the box leap into the air and have its edges kind of align properly, it does it based on its world space, which is the main root control of the bottom, the big square. So it's important that if you are going to have the box jump from here to a slanted plane, you're going to use that control to do it so that it knows where the edge is. Because if I rotate this big square one up, and then I start moving this around, that's how it knows what to do. So that is a slightly different workflow. Actually, it's a pretty different workflow than most bipedal characters, where you're really not supposed to move that base control. Now, there's a reason that I've mentioned that beware of trying to follow along, because if you are trying to follow along at this point, you might be running into some problems with selection of various things, and I will cover that in just a little bit. But I'm going to keep going through some of these characters. For now, though, goodbye rig and goodbye box. We need to deselect that. There we go. Next up, come on. Next up is Bungee Man. Bungee Man is going to be your cartoony character. This is the most squash and stretch, kind of, just classic, goofy animation stuff. This is the best option for that type of work at the moment, if you want to use these workflows. He's got squash and stretch. He's got a bunch of stuff like that. He also has no face rig, which makes life a lot easier. A lot of animation programs and schools, you'll see that before you get too good at animation, you're often not given characters with faces. And so if you're trying to dive into the keyframe workflow and you've never done it before, this also might be a nice safe bet if you want to do a character, because then you don't have to worry about the face, because that's a lot, unless you're using all the wonderful techniques you'll see in motion capture workflows we'll see. But if you're hand keying the face, that's a lot. I should clarify. What I would like to show you with this one, I actually want to jump back to Unreal, but I'm gonna do something slightly different here. I'm going to delete Manny, because again, I don't really need him right now. But I'm going to jump back to the group photo level sequence that I showed you. If I jump into the group photo level sequence, it's going to spawn all these different actors. And you'll see that I already have the box and I've already got Bungee Man in the box. But you'll notice something as I approach Bungee Man. He's disappearing. This is actually similar, different workflow here, but you'll notice the metahuman is currently bald. He actually isn't. As I get closer to the metahuman, he has hair, but it's disappearing. This and the Bungee character, there's. I'll come back to the metahuman when we do the metahuman, because I want to keep things grouped nicely. That way, if anyone were trying to revisit this video, you'd be able to kind of, things are contextually together. So for now, Bungee Man. It's a quick fix. It's very easy. If you load him in and you're like, oh, I can't get close enough to the rig, what's going on? If you select him and then in your details panel, search for bounds, B-O-U-N-D-S. There's a bound scale. And it's basically, think of it like your camera clipping. If I just crank this up to 10, if I had number lock on, if I crank this up to 10, I can now get close to him. So that's just the bounds at which he's drawn. You can see that here it's, here I can get about this. I'm not going to go through numbers. It's fine. You get the point. Switch it to 10. Now I can get close. It's not going to have a problem. So heads up. That's just a good tip for him. His bound scale set a little bit funny depending on the size of your scene. But let's go ahead and close sequencer. Goodbye to all the characters. And let's bring him in. So he's going to live inside of control rig, characters, Bungee Man, and then once again, you're going to pull up the skeleton mesh, you're going to drop him in, and I should have my sequencer open as well. Where's our rig tour? Here you are. So drop Bungee Man into the sequencer, and in this case, he actually did give me a rig, which is great. If he didn't give me a rig, if you're like, oh, there's no control rig, once again, all you have to do, I can delete the control rig and I can show you. You just go to add track, control rig, asset based, there you go. And that's going to give you his rig. And I'm not going to go through him in too much detail. He has a variety of controls that you'd probably expect from most bipedal characters. We can go over him more specifically in lab if you would like. But then you also have some options up top here that that can be useful as well. I'm going to go ahead and move forward, though, because this is a good enough explanation of how he works. He doesn't have proxy controls to worry about, so he is a more traditional character. Now we have the mech, and this one is super cool. I'm a fan of the mech. I think it's fun. If we jump over to control rig, once again, characters, mech, and meshes, you've got your skeletal mesh for this guy. And with him selected, drop him in. Oops, wrong thing. Mech, there you go. There he goes. There's a lot of hidden control in here that I want to point out. You can use this, I think I even put on the slide, you can use him as a character or as a prop. There are a lot of things you do manually, and there's even some procedural stuff in the rig itself. For example, if you come over to the feet, maybe you're just using them as like a background prop. Your characters are acting out, and they're kind of just standing by this mech, and we're working on the thing, there's some cool stuff in here. He's actually got cable dynamics inside of the little wires here. So there's some fun real-time stuff going on there. Various other parts of the character are going to, move and drive other things with this whole hydraulic system. It's just, clever rigging. You've got some different IK controls if you want to move this around, aim constraints and stuff going on here. And then inside, there's actually some additional controls, just to point out that there's a, the nozzle here, and then there's like the, whatever you would call this thing. So if you want to do stuff, you can. But this is starting to dip into some things I'm going to cover specifically with slides later on, but I do want to point them out now because it's very relevant at this point. You'll notice that if I select the, let's use this little red one. If I select this little red control, I have my orientation axis of transformation. It is currently aligned. I have just one arrow. I just move it straight out of the thing. Yours might not look like that. Yours might be in world space, and when you move it, it's like, it's pulling out. What's going on? There's a little button up right here, which I'll show you in another slide, but I want to just point it out. There's a little button right here that is the transform gizmo, and it will swap between world space and local space. So local space will align itself to the object, and world space is aligned to the world. There's also a hotkey for that. We'll cover all that. Moving forward, because we got lots more to cover. Your mannequins, these are obviously faceless. They are going to be very, very useful for various workflows. If you don't need a whole face, well, once again, these are a great option. But even if you are going to animate a metahuman, you might actually want to start off by animating a mannequin. They have the same skeleton inside as the metahumans. They were designed specifically to, it was a whole big thing to have the kind of mannequin skeleton be updated from Unreal 4 to 5. These are the 5 mannequins, and they're compatible with metahumans. And the reason that this is a big deal is because if you do some animation or retargeting or motion capture or whatever with the mannequin character, you can easily just swap it over to a metahuman. You can just swap the asset because, again, things like control rig, things like the skeletal meshes, they are hot swappable. They are not like tethered in a way that you might be used to from other applications. And they can be used as a proxy. So they are less hardware intensive. So if you think you're going to struggle with metahumans on your computer, but you want to use a metahuman, you can do a lot of your animation with a mannequin and then move that data over later very easily. Or if you don't intend on doing metahumans, you can also just stick with nonverbal body mechanics work with these characters as well. And there are a few things that we're going to cover specifically later on in the presentation at the very end of class with these mannequins. They actually have several control rigs inside of them that might be more or less useful depending on what you're doing, and we'll cover that later as we go. And then, of course, metahumans, which are exciting. I believe we should have one inside of here. So in the content folder, metahumans, we have Miles. I'm going to drop him in. Oh, yeah, I'll drop him in right now. Why not? So you'll notice here, Miles is a blueprint. He's not a skeletal mesh. I'm going to go ahead and drop him in here. Hello, Miles. We have the hair thing, which I'll cover in a second. But as we mentioned in the sequencer class, sometimes your characters can be blueprints. They don't have to be skeletal meshes. And so since a metahuman is a lot more feature-rich, there's a lot more stuff going on in there, is a more complex assembly, he's a blueprint. There is a skeletal mesh, and there is a control rig, and there are all these various things. Actually, is that accurate? Let me make sure. Body. Well, maybe I should maybe not say there's a skeletal mesh. There is a skeleton, and there is a mesh. That's kind of what I mean to say. What we care about, he's a blueprint. You'll notice that the hair is not loading at all levels of detail, and that is a performance setting. This particular hairstyle only shows up at certain resolutions or certain levels of detail. And so if you have that issue and you're like, oh, I need the hair, what you can do is in the details panel, there's all these different things, body, face, hair, whatever. If you scroll to the bottom, there's an LOD sync. And if I don't have bounds in there we go. If I, so if normally you don't have the bounds thing, that's from the old search, but if you select our MetaHuman, you go to details, you scroll down to LOD sync, there's a little thing that says forced LOD. And right now it's not set to forced LOD. The farther you are from the asset, the more it tries to lower the quality because your computer will thank you for it. But we can just say, hey, 0 or 1, I forced you to be at this level of detail, and now his hair will show up no matter what, because I forced it to stay at a certain quality setting. So anyway, metahumans. I think most people know what they are, but they're the more realistic characters. You can create them in a web interface, which is super cool. So you don't actually have to build them in Unreal. You can do it in your browser, and then you can pull them straight in. They are fully compatible with mannequins, as I mentioned, so that's one of the really nice workflows here. And they are ready to go with full facial animation. They have a separate control rig for the body and the face, which is actually similar to some industry tools. Someone asked an earlier question if, wow, not super relevant. More things for lab to talk about. They are more demanding hardware-wise, for sure. And so when you make them, you can actually download them to your Unreal project at different quality settings. So if you got a beefier computer, you can grab the high-res version. If you don't, you can grab a low-res version. I think it defaults to medium, but that's going to happen when you download it from Quixel. One thing I'd like to show you in your, so with MetaHuman, so let me show you the MetaHuman faces. You can keyframe it manually, and you can also use facial capture data. Most people are probably going to want to use facial capture data because, as you'll see in a second, the rig for it is very powerful, but probably more than anyone who's not already experienced as an animator is going to want to bite off. Here's what we do. Oh, and yes, just in case you missed it, to get the hair, I don't know if I said specifically the LOD sync. This particular hairstyle, I set it to a forced LOD of 1. 0 also works. I think 0 is the highest quality, and then they go up from there, or go lower from higher numbers, but don't quote me on that. If I want to bring this character into our sequencer, it's as easy as just drag and drop, right? And when I do that, immediately we're greeted with this control rig. And it's the same control rig, pretty much, that the mannequins have, which is on purpose. That's by design. And so we have all of our character stuff here, and you'll notice that for the face, you've got this wonderful interface. Which you might be like, huh? That's a lot. I don't know if I want to deal with that. That's okay. You have options. Every MetaHuman has this face under the hood. They have all the different ARKit blend shapes ready to go for mocap. They've got a bunch of different cool stuff inside. You can manually animate this with control rig, or you can just let it stay under the radar and just let this be driven by your facial capture data. Because if you are using motion capture data, it is piloting all the same stuff, but it's doing it, as more of a kind of input-output relationship. However, you can mix the two. If you want to bring in capture data and have it drive all the stuff and the blend shapes on the face, and then you want to push those poses, adjust those shapes, things like that, you can additively do that. I want to point out a few important things for anyone who does want to animate with this, though. You have some different controls kind of spread around here that you're going to be looking for if you are used to these workflows. And so to quickly point those out to you, let's do this. For ease of, for my sanity, I'm going to just go ahead and throw a shape in here and go like this, just so I can kind of block things off and we can see this a little bit better. Okay, so the top two, so I color coded them so that they're a little bit easier for you to kind of find them. Your FK eyes and your jaw controls, those are two, just depending on your workflow, those are two really common things you might want to look for. The eyes themselves, right here in the middle of the face, there's this big square. That is how you control the look. And you'll notice there's all kinds of different weights already included in there. So it's not just the eyeballs, it's also using lids and kind of the fleshiness around the face, which is very helpful. That saves you a lot of time, actually. So that is your kind of FKI control. And then your big one at the bottom is your jaw control. This right here. Rah, 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 rah. So if you want to just do this yourself, give them that nice cow chew, those are two of the most common controls you're probably going to need to know where they are. So if you want to block stuff out with those. Now, if you are someone who likes IK eyes, that is in the bottom right corner of the left side, there's a switches thing, that bottom switch. If I just take the switch and say, whoop, just slide it over, that gives you your IK eyes. So if you would rather have a look target, you can do that as well. And the default behavior is to have those eyes locked off in space. So he will continue looking in that spot even when I break his neck and go like this. Looks wonderful, doesn't he? Maybe I should, interesting, what have I done? Usually just you kind of play in the timeline and it fixes things. Let me, interesting. I seem to have hurt him. What I will try is I will just take the body and you know what? He looks great. Maybe this is a great example of where I'm going to go ahead and grab him, go back to his LOD sync, and I'm going to force the LOD to a value of 2, where his hair doesn't show up. And we're going to use that trick to hide the hair, because it's not really relevant to what we need right now. But I have deleted his control rig, so let's bring that back. Come on. Oh, he's already in here. I'm dumb. I need to just add his, let's just do it like this. It'll just come in by itself. This is the troubleshooting. Come on, come back in. Blueprint, Miles, get in. There we go. Sometimes, depending on where you're trying to drop it in the sequencer, you might need to drop it among other things. If you drop it too low, sometimes it doesn't register that you're trying to put it into sequencer. It's kind of weird. If you don't already have stuff in there. I mean, if you do already have stuff in there. Anyway, so face. There you go. That's some of the big things you need to know. And then there's also the face and IK follows, and those are going to live over here on the right. And so that's really important if you are using the IK eyes. If you slide this over and you move this around, if you come over here to the eyes, aim, follow, head, you can turn this little slider on. Whoop, and now the eyes will follow the head, if that is something you want. What's cool, though, is you can do partial values. So if you want to have it not follow the head much, but just a little bit, you can do that. And now when I move his head around, the eyes have, the IK things have some influence, so it doesn't feel like he's exactly like locked off, making crazy eye contact with something all the time. There's a little bit of influence from the head, but not fully. And then the last thing is the face GUI following the head. That is going to allow you to, whoop, this will either follow the head or it won't. So I think by default it's on, moves around with the head. If you don't want that to happen, you can turn that off, and then this will just snap back to its one location. Now the character will move around and that panel will not. But if you have a character in a car, that's going to be really hard to animate, because then the character will fly off into space and the little thing's just going to stay here, so you would need a separate camera to kind of watch that. Anyways, it's a very powerful system. There's a lot you can do with it, and it's a lot of fun to mess around with. I recommend trying it out. But for now, I want to get into kind of some of the bigger stuff, some of the more hands-on animation things in general. And then we'll take a break. But one thing I want to touch on, because I can't go any further without pointing these things out. We've already mentioned some of this in previous classes. I know that Noah covered some of these already, and I just want to draw extra attention to them. There are some settings that if you are an animator from another software, you're going to want to make some changes to kind of get used to Unreal faster, or to make Unreal behave in the way you expect. So in your editor preferences, just go ahead and search for these things and turn them on. This is some stuff that I've already been using. So if you were trying to follow along, you might have been having some trouble based on these things. Middle mouse pan is just going to help you move around like you're used to. The arc ball is how I'm moving things like this, and not axis by axis. Without the arc ball, this area does not spin freely. Also, I just want to point out, I don't know if we've covered this, but there is a default setting to have the transform, rotate, or translate, rotate, and scale set to this incremental mode where they snap by 10 degrees in rotation, they scale and translate in these kind of steps. Just make sure you toggle that snapping through these little 3 buttons right here. That way you get the free motion, and you can have him do his little thing without snapping. Screen rotate, also important. That's this one to show it in practice. Screen rotation is from wherever your camera is. It's this ring around the rotation orb. So it's only going to show up when you're in rotation mode, and that allows you to rotate from the camera's perspective. That's usually very helpful. And then the left mouse drag marquee, you want to make sure that's turned on. That's what allows me to drag select various controls and not click and drag and it moves the camera. This doesn't always work. It works most of the time. Sometimes it gets a little bugged out and it kind of doesn't listen to you. It is what it is. It's all work in progress. These features are brand new, so I imagine they're working on it. And then there are some other things here that I'm just going to show you how to find them. I'm not going to spend too much time here. If you go to edit your preferences, if you search, so inside of here, the easiest way to get to these other ones that I've mentioned here, the quickest way to get to these ones is type the word viewport in parentheses. Because if I just type the word viewport, there's a lot of options. But if you put that in parentheses, this gives you a lot of hotkeys that are animation specific that were put here by the team building out these tools. So if you want to adjust any of that, you can. I've just taken some recommendations from Fred Nielsen, who will be giving a guest talk later on in the fellowship. But he's got a video on YouTube from Unreal Fest going over his hotkeys, and that's pretty much all the same stuff here. Anyways, one more thing, save your preferences. If you end up having to do this multiple times, I thought I changed that setting, just make sure that you save the preferences, set them as default inside of your edit preferences window. So that way you don't have to do this multiple times. Okay, a couple other things I want to go over really quick. Some useful tips to your interface. This is the thing I mentioned before up here in the image. This little icon that's slightly different, that's the button that did the local and world space thing. But when I'm jumping ahead a little bit here again. When you bring something into Animation Sequencer, and we have this mess of a scene now, you're automatically thrust into animation mode, which we'll cover a little bit more specifically in a little bit. But I want to just point out a few things. You have a variety of panels that are going to be somewhat familiar. This is your kind of, this is this, but I'm just going to show you. If you have something selected, say we grab our character's hips, for example. I said hips. I did grab it. Yeah, good. Actually, you know what? I want to grab this. Let's grab the root. So your anim details panel. Anim details is a little tab down here. There's details and there's anim details, 2 different details things. Anim details only shows up when you're in animation mode, which again I'll touch on. We'll go into, but anim details is your channel box for those Maya animators. That is where you're going to find your transformation matrix for translate, rotate, scale, your values, set keys, all that kind of stuff. So if I grab the head and I want to see what the values are, they're all in here. If you have any specific settings, IFK, IK, those kinds of things, you're going to find those in here as well. Anim details is your channel box. And then you have a details panel, which is your normal Unreal, like your details and your settings and things like that for various things. That's where I was doing the LOD syncs. That's where I was doing bounds, settings, all that kind of stuff. Anim details for animation. Once again, this here, that's your button for world space and local space. The hotkey by default, I think, is Control tilde. Drawn on there. So that's how you do that. And then you've got multi-viewport layouts, which you've already kind of seen, but I just want to remind you that, once again, hamburger menu, layouts, that's where you can adjust the panels, and you can set, a camera view and opposing view, which I would recommend as a workflow. Have your camera, what your camera sees always be visible, but be able to move around and animate freely in a separate window. Or if you don't have the screen space and you do just need to have the one, whoops, your bookmarks. Being able to use bookmarks. Maya has a really nice feature that I hope gets implemented, which is being able to step back and forward, undo and redo just your camera moves. I don't know of a way to do that in Unreal yet, but if you're looking for that functionality, bookmarks are going to give you the closest thing, where you can save specific spots for your camera and very easily just jump back to them. So if I come over here and say, "This is such a beautiful view. I want to gaze into his eyes, his lovely wall eyes," I can say Control 2, hit my bookmark, come over here, and just say number 2. Oh no, I moved my camera. Oh no, I've done it again. So get comfortable with that. So that covers all these. Content drawer, Control spacebar, that's the thing that pulls up the bar. You probably know that. And then the last thing, just to make sure it's in here, is if you're moving around, you're like, oh god, I can't get to my character. It's moving too fast. If you are moving around and you use your mouse wheel and you scroll it down, it'll change the intensity to more or less, more or less, more or less, right? And that's something you're going to want to also be very used to when you're animating, because sometimes you want that finer control. Okay. Ooh. Here we go. Last thing before we go on a quick little break here. Your animation hotkeys. G is the most common thing you're probably going to be going back and forth between. So if you're posing, you're like, ah, how's this look? Hit G, and it's going to turn game mode on and off. So it's going to show and hide all these overlays, and that's going to be really helpful. To change my camera speed, to make sure I answer that, if you're moving around, so I'm holding right mouse click and I'm walking around with WASD, right? So holding my mouse click. As I'm doing this, if I scroll up on my mouse wheel, it's more intense. If I scroll down on my mouse wheel, it becomes less intense. So I'm doing this while navigating by using my mouse wheel up and down. That's how you do that. Yeah, so G is going to show and hide all those overlays and all your control rig stuff. Your control and tilde. I need to fix this. I don't know why. Hopefully your guys' PDF version doesn't have this weird spacing, because it didn't have it before. But yeah, control tilde was the way that I was doing the world space toggle, and various other things in here. There's one thing that I'll show you later. I don't have it written here, but I'll show you a specific other hotkey that you'll rarely need to use, but I'll show you later. There's not a whole lot of other stuff we need to get in here, except that if you actually, there is one last thing I want to I do want to show you specifically. This one, Shift C, toggle camera view. So I don't have a camera in the scene right now, but if I were to just create a camera and say, here's my camera, and it's beautiful, and once again, there we go, and just do it the manual way. We have this camera, and let's say I don't want to change it, but I want to get out of it and I want to go move around. If I say Shift C, Shift C will pop me out of my camera, and I can move around my scene. And then if I hit Shift C again, it pops me back into my camera. So Shift C will pop you in and out of your camera. And so it'll just toggle between, it's not popping you in and out, it's specifically going from your camera view and your perspective view. So it's letting you swap. Quick way to do that. And so on and so on. Control and L will let you to change the lighting, do this cool little thing. I don't think we need to worry about too much of that. That's more for if you are trying to pose something and you're having a hard time seeing your character because maybe the shadows are across the face in a weird way, and you need to do that because there's a whole class on lighting. I don't want to dip into that too much. I just want to show you that sometimes you might need to adjust the lighting to see stuff better. But anyways, the sequencer commands are the ones I really want to focus on for a second. S is still, for anyone who's new to animation, S is usually the button you push in Maya to set a key on all your stuff. So if you are working with a character in Sequencer and you want to set a key on something, by the way, the camera wasn't showing up a second ago because I had game mode turned on or off. G. If I want to grab this control here and I want to set a key in my timeline, I hit S and it sets a key. So think of S as set key. And it will set a key on all of the different things that you might have selected. So if I had grabbed lots of stuff, it's going to set a key on all of it, if it can. Everything I had selected. You can also set a key manually in the graph editor, which I'll show you some graph editor stuff a little bit later. I want to show you some graph editor specific stuff, but we'll come back to that. You can frame step, you can key step, so you can just go through your timeline with Alt and period and comma by default. I've changed mine to, mine are now, it's basically it's Z through V on my keyboard. So just where my left hand sits, I now have buttons to step through here. Or if I set a key on all these things, I can show you that I also have buttons to jump between my keyframes. So you can see that I'm just snapping to keyframes, or I can go frame by frame. These are the default frame step and key step. I'd recommend changing them to be a little bit closer to where your hand sits on your keyboard. And then the last thing, F10, isolate selected tracks. This can be very, very helpful. Let me double check one thing here. Yes, good. If you have a lot of stuff in here and you don't really need to see everything, I really just want to work with the body and the hips and the right hand. If you hit F10, it'll just hide everything else. Now, if I select a control that is not part of those things, it is actually going to pull it up in my case. Well, these are settings that I have set from before. I have a slide for this. I'm going to come back to that. I don't want to get too ahead of myself. But F10 is your toggle to kind of isolate selected stuff in your sequencer. That's the important thing I want to show you right now. With that, let's take a 10-minute break because I want to dive into a whole bunch of other stuff inside a sequencer and kind of get more into workflow now. I want to show you some actual animation stuff. Time to see some magic. So obviously, depending on your work needs, you may or may not be able to just fully commit and say, I love Unreal now. I want to switch forever. But maybe by the end of this, you'll want to. There's some cool stuff, but the first thing we've got to do is we've got to set up our shot. Now, you've seen most of the components to this, but I'm just going to run through it really quick and say, great, we want to start animating. We want to start playing around. What do we do? What are the steps? It's pretty easy. What I'm going to do is, well, I guess I should let you absorb the slide for a second. We have our level sequences, which we need one. You might use subsequences, you might not, but level sequences, we need to set that up. We're going to bring in our actors. We're going to organize them, which is a very important step that I haven't been using in this at all. I've just been dropping stuff in and deleting stuff, and you want to be a little bit more organized, not just for your sanity, but also for function. There's some really cool stuff that organization gives you. And then you want to make sure you have a camera at all times. It's easy enough to put stuff in the engine and move things around, but with animation, you always want to have a camera so you know what you're going to see from that perspective. Because it really, as long as the camera likes it, you're good. You can cheat all kinds of other stuff. So maybe you've got stuff in your scene, maybe you don't. But if we want to build our scene just here from scratch, what I'm going to do, make a level sequence, add this in here, and we'll call this shot setup, just for fun. With that in here, I'm going to go ahead and grab my character, plop them on in. There you go. That gives us our character in the sequence. We've seen this a million times, but I want to just reinforce it one more time. And I'm also going to create a camera from this specific view of right here. I just think this is the best angle ever. Boop. There's my camera. And of course, as you saw yesterday, there's a variety of things you can do with the camera. I'm not going to dip into that topic much, just to show you that, okay, cool, there's our camera. I'll say Shift-C to pop out of it. So that by itself gives us quite a bit of stuff in the sequencer. You can see automatically, there's a ton of stuff to scroll through here, and I've got a couple slides to show you how to clean this up. But for now, I'm just going to collapse and collapse. It's also worth pointing out that the way I did this, I just little camera button, and you have to remember that that created this little lightning bolt icon. It created a spawnable camera where I have a possessable blueprint. So my character was there before, and he is also here in the sequencer with a control rig. This camera does not exist outside the sequence. So once again, we get rid of the sequencer. Character's still there. Camera is not. So let me go back in here and go back to our shot setup. So just reminding you of that. So heads up. Okay. Now to just run through, like, great. So we have our stuff in here. Let's play around with them a little bit. If I interesting, let me delete him, pull him back in here. I'm also going to delete the camera cuts. I don't really need that right now. Okay. So if I wanted to just set a couple of keys, all the other preferences I mentioned to you are already there. So I should be able to just click and drag and go like this and just say, give me all the stuff. And that should work. And if I hit S, it sets a key on everything, which is great. And if I were to just set, another key here, so I hold everything for a couple of frames, I don't do anything, and then I'll say, well, let's go ahead and have him wave or something. I'll bring his arm up. He's going to look awful. Don't forget your shoulders. Shoulders are super, super important when you're animating by hand. I'm going to go ahead and rotate. And you might think to yourself, like, this looks more tedious than I thought it would be. Animators are not thinking that. They're just like, yeah. But if I say, hey, look at that. Now he's waving. If I just do that and, whoops. If I say that, there he goes. He throws it up. And you can see there's actually some little dynamic things happening in here with his hood. Actually has some cool little physics stuff in there. So if I jump back to my camera, it's not doing it. Oh, wait, that's okay. I jump to perspective and go to my camera manually. That's another way I can do it there. You know what? I gotta just hit this button. Anyway, there we go. Beautiful animation. So quick, so snappy. That's kind of the default. That's just like the base. Cool, I've set up my shot, great. But there are a few sequencer things that I want to touch on. But the first thing that I think you need to know is you've done this beautiful masterpiece. It's time to share it with the world. How do you do it? We can preview in real time, and that's not an issue, but let's just say we want to get this out. You don't need to play blast, because that's kind of a thing of the past. You can render. And there is a whole class on rendering. So I'm just going to give you the beginnings of this. If you want to export your stuff, you want to share it with your group, you want to, show stuff to your teams and things like that, you need to know how to get your work out. And so there's a little slate button in the sequencer that I'll show you in a second, and that'll pull up the movie render queue. And from there, you can make some different adjustments to file formats and stuff. Let me show you how that. I'll read through the slides. There are some, so it's going to pull up the movie render queue, because you can have different sequences all run together. So if you have 10 sequences, which you definitely won't have for this fellowship, but if you had a bunch of sequences and you wanted to run them all, or if you had a bunch of different animation versions and you wanted to, test them against each other, hypothetically, that's all a thing you could do. When you have these individual jobs, because that's what happens when you hit the little button, it adds that sequence as a job. You can adjust the settings. You can change it from the default as a JPEG image sequence, and you can change all kinds of stuff. I'm going to mention here, you can set it up to render a movie file, but to do that, you have to add some custom encoder stuff. I'm not going to be covering that. That is not the typical workflow. I'm not going to show you how to do it. I'm just pointing out it can be done, but expect image sequences, which might be different than some of you are used to, but image sequences are usually how you render stuff in 3D. So let's go ahead and do that. So I have this absolutely wonderful animation, just so good. What I'd like to do is I don't really want to use all these frames. So real quick, I'm actually going to change my playback range just to save us some time here. This little playback options drop down, you've seen this before. I'm just going to drag the end way over here to the left, just so I only have like 38 frames. Not that it's going to take that long to render this, I just don't want a bunch of random frames on my computer for no reason. So with that done, just collapse all this. Something that I'd recommend even before getting to this point, just for organization, is I mentioned organization. Let me do that really quick. This is a good opportunity to kind of look at your sequence and say, cool, do you have everything you need? Is it all ready to go? Probably, but let's just go ahead and organize it as well. If you right click on our Miles character here, we can add him to a group. We can add him to a folder. I'm going to go ahead and move him to a folder. Boop. And inside that folder, I'm just going to rename this character. And then I could have one for my camera or multiple cameras. I could have one for my environment, whatever you want. You can have different folders inside the sequencer, and those folders are different than what is in the outliner. I also want to point out, I guess I didn't, whoops. I'll do this so you can see both. I didn't point this out. In the same way that we have an anim details panel and we have a details panel, you also have an outliner and an anim outliner. Your outliner is your scene outliner. It's all the assets in your scene, all the actors and all the things that exist in your level. Whereas your anim outliner is specifically all of the controls on the character that you're working with, and all the different characters that are in here. And so if you're looking for the hips, I can type in hips, and it's going to show me my hip stuff. So if you're looking for the equivalent of like a character picker or a quick way to find controls to select them, you could do that with the sequencer, but I'd recommend using the anim outliner to say, I need the head, quick, the head control, where are you? There you are, and it'll select it, and we're good to go. No, and now I have a key. Great. It's even better than I expected. Happy accidents. So that's your anim outliner. But you'll notice what I want to show you over here was that in the outliner, Blueprint Miles is still here. He's not in a folder. So your outliner folders and your sequencer folders are different. You can have folders in each spot, which is very helpful actually, because you're probably going to want to organize your outliner here as well. The characters, cameras, assets, you can organize stuff in your over here. But what's cool about doing it in the sequencer is when you do retiming changes to a folder, it actually applies that down into anything within it, which is a really cool little tip. So if you had 5 characters all working together doing all the stuff, one person slaps another character. Obviously, if you have one character slap someone and then the other character goes, ugh, you want those 2 actions to stay together. So if you start retiming stuff, if you have them both in a folder, you can retime the folder, and that matching animation will move for both characters. Anyways, with this properly organized, now that it's so much more organized than it was before, I hope you're impressed. I'm just gonna go ahead and hit the slate button. So if I say render, it'll open up the movie render queue, and you'll see that it gives us our job. It gives us the sequence of shot setup with some settings which we haven't looked at. So if I click on my settings here, you can see it defaults to JPEG image sequence, and here's my resolution, here's the directory. So it wants to default to the movie renders area of the project, which is great. Blah, 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 a bunch of stuff. We don't actually need to change any of this as long as your resolution is good, which it probably is. We're good to go. And again, if you wanted to change the folder, you can. I'm just gonna say render local. And it's happening on my other monitor. I'm gonna see if I can move it over. Oh no! I wanna move it over, but it's doing a little compilation saying compiling shaders. There's a little progress bar. I'm gonna try and drag it. Come on. There you go. I want you to see how quick it is. Just in time. I barely had time to get it on my monitor to show it to you before it finished, because it's very fast. So yeah, it's quick. I hope you didn't blink. Anyways, with that now done, if I go over to my well, what I can do is this. If I go to my content browser and I right click on a folder, any folder, I can say show in Explorer, and it'll pull that folder up in my Windows File Explorer. And then that's where we have our saved movie renders, and this is where it defaults to. And let's see, there it is. There they are. Our wonderful frames. If they look blurry, it's because I'm just moving through them really quickly. There is motion blur, actually, but anyways, that gives you your image sequences. Thank you for that. Yeah, if you plan on rendering, maybe don't get rid of camera cuts or add it back when you're done. Anyways, that is important though, because if you want to show your work out, that's how you're gonna have to do it. Once again, you can set it up to do image or to do movies, but that's a different thing that we're not going to worry about too much. it's nice to have the flexibility to render your image sequences the way you need. Okay. Now, I want to get into more kind of keyframe animation workflow stuff. So there are a variety of tools that Unreal has given us, but I want to start at the beginning. So Sequencer, you've seen a bunch of stuff. There's a couple things I want to touch on that I don't know if we've really gotten to pay attention to yet. Your sequencer is obviously your timeline. It is also your dope sheet. If you use Maya, a dope sheet's really not that important. If you're coming from Blender, the dope sheet is a lot more useful. And if you've worked at studios that have had more interesting timelines, like DreamWorks' Primo has a really interesting timeline dope sheet combo thing, Unreal's kind of in that direction, where your timeline, your dope sheet, your sequencer, it does a lot more than just scrub through time and set keys. And obviously, stuff that you want to animate has to go in there. One of the things that I want to point out to you in the sequencer, though, is this little filter thingy, which there's various ways to do this, but if I were looking for hips, I can search in the sequencer and find hips controls. Now that's easy enough up here as well. If I search hips, it'll give you the same thing. But this is great for, manually animating and grabbing your controls and trying to pose stuff. But if you're looking for your keys and you're trying to do your graph editor, for example, being able to search in the sequencer can be really useful because you can grab that and say, show me the curves. And there's no animation data because I didn't do anything with the hips. But this little filter is handy. And also, it's not just about the search. There's also specifically a filter button. So if you have all this stuff in here, and before I was like, I don't need the camera cuts, it was just in my way. Really all it was is I didn't want to see it. And what I should have done is just filtered and say, hey, you know what? I actually just want to see my skeletal meshes. Or I just want to see my camera stuff. You can filter your sequencer based on what you need to work with. So if you do want to work with your cameras, great, there you go. And if you don't, you can switch it just to skeletal mesh, and that will get rid of all the other stuff. Get rid of is the wrong word. It will hide that stuff from you, which is very, very handy. Now, most of this is in here just so you have a record of it. But in your animation sequences, well, I keep wanting to show you stuff in the engine, but I need to let you have time to read. Animation sequences. You can keyframe stuff, obviously, as I've been doing. You can use blueprints, you can use animation sequences. An animation sequence is its own little type of asset. It contains animation data. It's very, very handy. I'm going to show you how they work, but you can do a lot with them. Animation sequences are typically what you're using for most game animation stuff, as far as I understand it. Anytime you're using motion capture data, you're using animation sequences. You can create animation sequences from your keyframe animation data. You can do all kinds of stuff, but you can loop them. You can put them next to each other. You can blend them together and have one transition from one animation to another animation. You can do all kinds of really cool stuff. I'm going to come back to this slide to show you some more specific stuff, but let me show you how this works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in our mannequins because they are a really fun example of this. Characters, mannequins, meshes, and let's go ahead and grab Quinn. And let's grab Manny too. We're both invited. Come on in here, guys. So if I bring them into the sequencer, by default, they're given control rigs. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm actually going to delete the control rig off of Quinn. So you can see she just has control rig mannequin body, delete, gone. So now I've got one that's ready to be hand animated and one that is not. What's really cool about this is if I take the Quinn rig, or if I take the Quinn skeletal mesh, it's a habit to break is to keep calling things rigs, because technically it's not. The thing I want to do is she's ready for animation. There's an animation track on here. It's just empty at the moment. And so what I'd like to do is, first of all, I'm going to extend my playback range once again back to 150, so I have some more room. On animation, I'm going to add some animation. And you see she actually already has animation sequences built in here, which is why I chose these characters. But if I choose an idle and hit play, there's an idle. You can pretty much load an animation sequence right onto your characters through the sequencer. And you can retime this, move it around, do all kinds of stuff. I can delete it and say, you know what, back to normal. Let's do something else. Let's do a different animation. Let's just go ahead and do a run. I can do a run. And what's going to be funny about this, careful, it'll try to pop it down wherever your playhead was, which for me, I was at the end of the timeline, so I got to drag this back over to the beginning. Here, she's got to run, and then it stops. Why does it stop? Because the length of this animation sequence is only about 50-something frames. If you want to extend it, just grab the handle. Whoop, and now to loop. This is why looping animation is very helpful for places like Unreal. I'm also going to loop my animation. So if you hit play in your sequencer and it hits the end and you're like, oh, but I wanted to see it again, I don't want to have to keep hitting my button. Down here at the bottom by the playback controls, there's a no looping. You can switch this to loop. So now it'll just replay your sequencer every time. And so what's cool is we've got this animation. You'll notice she's running in place. That's very normal. That's typically what you want in a game engine because the player is in control of where the character goes. You don't want the character just running off into space. If you're making a short film or something, or if you're doing a fellowship contribution, you might want to have the character move through space, but that's a separate thing. Right now, what I want to show you is, great, we have this animation data, and just for kicks, I'm going to, let's do one at a time. What I can do with this is, if I shrink this down, I'm going to go ahead and add another layer of animation. Say animation, let's go ahead and add the idle that we had before. Now, you can see that they're kind of on top of each other. Well, they are on top of each other. And so they're kind of like combining in an interesting way. What I can do is I can take my idle and shift it over here. So I can have, one right after another on different layers, and you're going to see she'll snap from one to the next. So we have run, then we have an idle. If I put them on the same level, on the same layer, nothing changes until I start to blend them together. If I start pushing them into each other, that's where you start to blend animation sequences. And this is maybe not the best example because the character's running in place and then stopping in place, but this is how you can combine different sequences and do some different stuff. What I would like to show you, though, is this. With whatever we have here, an animation sequence is just animation data. It's the same thing as what we do with a control rig. It's just a different way of getting there. And what's really powerful about this is we can take this character, go ahead and collapse all the Manny stuff. I don't need him right now. I can take the Quinn character. I can right click on her actor in the sequencer. I can say bake to control rig. And if I switch this, you actually see there's multiple control rigs I could bake to. I haven't showed you this yet, but there are, I mentioned that there were different control rigs for the mannequins. I'm just going to stick with body for the moment. And that's going to open up this little baking option. And what it's going to allow me to do is going to allow me to bake that animation data onto control rig. So I'll just say go. What I end up with is she now has a control rig, is all the same animation data, but now it's editable. All that data is in there. So I now have everything in there, good to go. And you can see I have a few weird little like hitches in the curves here, things like that, and that's coming from that blend between the run and the idle. So I can come in and I can mess with it. However, there's a lot of keyframes, and I have only just selected the one control. Like this might be a little overwhelming for some people, especially if you've never worked with mocap before. Just to suddenly have all this data to sift through. So that's great, but what do you do with it? Well, what's really nice about this, and this is something that I'm only going to touch on this a little bit because there is a whole other class on additive animation and advanced workflows, but just to kind of give you a sneak peek of that. I mentioned that you can keep adding tracks of animation, so we could just do that. I could just say, all right, well, Quinn's got some animation. It's all here. Here's the weight of it. Right now what happened is the animation sequences that used to be here, they're disabled. You can see that they're not active. So they do still exist in here, but they're not being used. They are turned off, and instead we're using the control rig. So she actually still has both in here. It's non-destructive as of this point. I could delete the whole control rig and she goes back to not having anything. And then I could take these tracks and I could go ahead and reactivate them. And we're back to using an animation sequence. I could also delete them, whatever. I'm gonna go ahead and undo and keep it with control rig. So I could just delete these because I'm pretty much done with them. So may as well. There they go. Goodbye. I'm just on control rig, as if I did it from scratch. But what I can do is I can say animation, and I can say add animation. Oops, actually, we do it this way. If I do it with the control rig, if I say, you know what, I really like her animation, but I wish you were looking off to the left, I can go to my control rig, and rather than grabbing her head control and with all this data in here, adjusting the curves to make her turn her head, I can say, it'd be a lot easier to do that clean. So I will. I'll just say add a section, add an additive section of animation. It adds an additional control rig on top of the other one, which I need to make sure it actually picks up the whole animation. And so now I can go ahead and I can just key. You can see I have no keys. Go over here, and I'll have her turn her head. And she'll go like that, and she'll look up that way. And she'll hold that pose, and then she'll turn back over here. And since I have auto key on, I don't have to set manual keys every time I make a change. But now, there you go. I've added some head animation on top of all that other stuff. And if I need to mess with the other animation, I absolutely can, because it's all part of control rig now. But you'll notice that I have the ability to separate my animation from the original baked animation. And if you right click on one of these layers, this is where if you right click in here, this is where you can say key this section. So that's super important, is whichever layer you want to mess with, you want to make sure it's highlighted in green. And to get it highlighted in green, you need to right click and say key this section. And that's how you switch animation layers, basically. So, and again, I'm not going to go any deeper into this because you will get a whole class on these workflows and stuff, but I just want to show you the capability because this is super important that this is here. You absolutely have the ability to take motion capture data or whatever animation that you happen to get, whether it's input or whatever. You can take any animation sequence that exists, bake it down to control rig, and bake it right back. So if I take all this animation and say, cool, I really like all this work she does. I like how she turns and she sees this, she stops and she goes, wow, that was crazy. I can't believe I just saw that thing. I can right click on the character, and in the same way I can say bake to control rig, I can also bake an animation sequence out of the animation, which I'm going to go ahead and just throw in my content. I'll just throw it in the content folder for now. Again, you should be a little bit more organized than this, but I'll just call this SK run look. Say run look, and it's going to pull up a little thing here. It's going to say, hey, do you want everything? And yeah, just gimme. I don't worry too much about it. And cool, it'll do that. And we're still using the control rig. It's still in here. But if I go ahead and say, you know what? I'm gonna take Manny over here. He's looking a little boring. I think I'd like them to have something in unison here. So I'm gonna go ahead and say, hey Manny, you don't need a control rig. You just need an animation sequence. I'm going to say, what I call it, run look. There it is. And you'll notice that it again, see, it's kind of dropped off into where my playhead was. So I might need to retime this and move it over to the beginning. But now they're going to do the same thing. They're both going to look, and it feels a little robotic. So I'm going to just retime him a little bit, shift him. So now I can have them start at slightly different times, and now slightly offset. So you can use that data between characters. And so just for kicks, one more time, Miles blueprint. Hello, hello, you've got a body. Let's get rid of it. Let's add, let's add some animation. And, oh, right, I have to set that up. By default, you're not going to find it in here because it is a different skeleton. However, they are compatible. And I have a slide. I'm going to come back to that later. I'm getting a little ahead of myself because I'm getting excited. The possibilities. I've also broken his hand. That's okay. You can move the data from mannequins to the character, but there is something you need to set up, which I have a slide for. So for now, we'll revel in this. Ooh, ah, very nice. So animation sequences can be looped, snapped, blended, additively combined, baked to the rig, merged with keyframe data. You can do all kinds of cool stuff with it. And this is where we start to get into the really interesting stuff of working in Unreal. And so hypothetically, you could download any animation data from whatever, the various motion capture libraries we have, and you can adjust them, you can tweak them. There is still IK retargeting, and like there's other stuff as well to do these kinds of things. But if you're working in sequencer specifically, these are some tools that you should know about. Now, I have skipped over all of this until this point, but I need to point them out. Hopefully you've already kind of gotten a lot of this from the previous class. Franco covered a lot of great settings that I didn't feel it was super necessary to call out until now. I do need to mention it. In your sequencer, there are some things. This is another reason why I'm hoping not too many people are following along unless you already had these things set. But you need to make sure that some things are set in your sequencer. Whole frame snapping is the first one. I know we saw that already, but I've got to call it out. This little magnet here, you need that. You absolutely need that. It's the first thing you want to check. If I have that turned on, every time I move from frame to frame, I actually move from frame to frame. If you turn that off, suddenly I'm in these, I think we called them inner frames. I always called them subframes, but I think inner frames might be the right word for them. Either way, you can end up setting keys on partial frames. You do not want that under any circumstance. Well, there may be some circumstance, but as an animator, no. As an animator, there are no circumstances that you want that. So make sure snapping is turned on. That's the first thing. You obviously also have your frame rate, which I typically use 24. My team knows that we are doing our project in 24. I think most teams probably are. But I guess that's up to the individual mentors, so don't let me speak for them. But my team is using 24, so we want to make sure we set that to 24. I'm going to leave it at 30 for the purpose of this demo because it's kind of cool seeing it super smooth for the class. It makes it feel very real time. But you want to animate in whatever you want to animate in. Auto key, super important. That's what's allowing me to scrub and change a pose and not have to remember to set a key, just like that. Super, super important. If you don't have this turned on and you go and you make this pose change and you do all this work and you're like, yeah, this is amazing. I love all the animation I'm doing. Hooray. The moment you change frames, you lose all that work. In that case, it doesn't look like that's the case, but I think that's because it didn't have a key on it to begin with. That's okay. The main thing is you want to make sure auto key is turned on so you always get keyframe data when you make a change. You can also change the behavior of that. The default in most tools, like in Maya, is if you already have a key on something. I know Franco covered this, but if you want auto key to work, you have to first set a key on whatever it is you're trying to work with. So if you're going to start animating a character in general, first thing you want to do is grab all the controls and set a complete key somewhere, frame one, whatever. And then do your initial pose and make sure auto key is turned on, because then it'll actually key those changes and not just snap back to default the moment you scrub to the next frame. But when you make changes on other frames for those previously keyed controls, this little drop-down menu is going to adjust how this works. Key changed is typically the default. It's how most 3D software works. It'll just key the things you're modifying. But there's also key group and key all. So if you wanted to move the pinky finger and it keys the whole body, you can tell it to do that. So if I say key all, if I come over here and I specifically grab the pinky finger, that should, where am I right now? Here we go, Quinn. Quinn. Hang on a second. I have a lot of stuff going on here. Let me just go ahead and say, hey, all that animation data, all that control rig stuff, goodbye. Let's reset you. And let's go ahead and just say add animation, add control rig, asset based, body. Get that back. And then once again, first thing to do, grab all controls, set a complete key. There you go, move a couple frames forward. Should be able to just go, let me make sure, should be able to just go, meh. And in this case, it did only key the certain things. Some things don't always work the way you expect, and I might even be misusing it, but, oh, wait. Oh, I apologize. I misinterpreted this. There's a couple different ways that you can use these things. This one actually is set to just do all of the translate, rotate, and scale, rather than just the section that you're using. So I'm actually misusing that a little bit. I'm confusing that with if you are blocking your animation, just quick tip, if you're blocking your animation, you might want to key everything all at once. And to do that, let me actually show you how to do that properly. What you can do is you can actually just click this button right here. This is your step between keys or set a keyframe. You can set a key on a specific thing. So like the foot roll left control, boop, you can key that. If you want to key the whole thing, you can click this on the control rig and it'll key the whole control rig. So that is actually different than I said it was, but that's okay. There we go. So whole frame snapping, auto key behavior still is the thing that's worth noting. Frame rate. Then these last ones, these are very, very helpful. Auto expand nodes. This is so helpful. If you don't like every time, because I keep having to collapse these menus. So if I grab something with Manny, every time I'm like, oh, let's close Manny, whatever. Here, for example, I grabbed the spine and it jumped me down to spine 3. You might want to adjust inside of the inside of your settings here. You will want to do a couple of things. Franco made a great point. Keep playhead and playback range while scrubbing. You definitely want that. 100% agree all the way. You want to make sure that is set so you're not scrubbing outside of the bounds of where you have your animation. And then, yeah, so that's right there. That's this one. And then the last one is right here, auto expand nodes on selection. And that one lives, is it? I always lose this one. View options, I think, right? Yes. Auto expand nodes on selection. It's on by default. So that is every time you have it, nicely cleaned up and you say, a nice, clean, organized sequencer, and you grab this and you go, oh, it's doing a good job. Why are you doing such a good job right now? Interesting. Turn this on again. Oh, I have the wrong, right, this needs to be open. So yeah, so if I grab this and it goes like, that's what I'm trying to show you. I had it collapsed too high up. So if I have Quinn skeletal mesh open, but the control rig here is nice and collapsed. Like, okay, cool, I've got the control rig and I'm keying my control rig and then I grab the hips or grab the spine and it reopens all this mess. If you don't want that to happen, is you want to have a little bit more control over what is visible and what's not, that's where in here you can turn off auto expand nodes on selection. And so when you turn that off, that is auto expand nodes on selection. Now when I click a control, it won't do that. I can just go ahead and key stuff myself. And I can just manage what's visible on my own. So that might be really useful. And that's where also that hotkey from earlier, F10. So if I have selected things, I can go ahead and open this up and I can grab all the things that I want and I can say, I want just these things. And I say F10. F10, why are you not doing what I want you to do? Come on now. Like something's bugged right now. Normally F10, you saw it earlier. It worked earlier, so that's kind of odd that I'm having trouble with it right now, but you can have a more specific set, and that way when you click stuff, it's not changing what's going on. That's okay though. So now you've seen these, and then obviously hotkeys, you might want to adjust, things like that. So now, animation mode, we've kind of talked about it for a little bit, but I want to be very specific about showing you this now. Your default mode of moving around in Unreal is selection mode. And when you are not in a sequencer, this is what you're typically in. You have your outliner, you have your details, and you don't usually have a sequencer, but I have it open because we have it open. And in this top menu over here, if you were doing different things, you might be like, oh, I'm going to move some stuff around, I'm going to do some modeling or whatever. Not for this fellowship necessarily should you be doing all that, but you might be in a different mode. When you want to animate, you need to be in animation mode, because if you're like, where are my control rigs? I don't see any of my stuff. I have a sequencer open, what's going on? I have a problem, I can't animate. You have to make sure you are actually in animation mode. When you are in animation mode, that enables you to see these things. And that's what also pulls up these other windows, your anim outliner, your anim details, and so on. And so as we said, the anim details is your channel box. Your anim outliner is where all of your character controls live. Your outliner is where all your scene assets go. And then you have a thing with animation workflow tools that lives inside of just the left panel, which is just called animation. So in here, there are a whole bunch of little tools that I've neglected to really show you up until now. Now's the time. So one thing that that this is really good for, well, this is good for many things, but one of the things that I want to show you is there's a button right here that says only select rig controls. If you work in Maya, you might be used to doing the thing where you put assets in a display layer and you set them to reference so that you can't grab them, because you might be trying to drag select your rig controls, and you grab the ground plane and you grab the table and the prop, and you're like, stop it. I just want to grab the controls, not the assets, not the mesh data in the scene. Typically, if you are doing the drag selection thing that I told you to change the setting for, that will just default to using controls. But if you're trying to click on something and you miss, you might end up grabbing the floor. Where is the floor? Yeah, you might end up grabbing the floor, for example. Oh no, that's not what I wanted. Right? Whoa. Turn down my sensitivity and do that. The hotkey F still works to focus on selected as well. That's how I was over here and I said F. Focus is there. I didn't put that on the hotkeys because to me that was second nature, but maybe I should have for anybody who's not used to that. But F to do that. Anyways, if you turn select on here, now I can only select rig controls. So I can click on this floor plane all I want. I can click on this little level sequence thing. I can't grab it. If I turn that off, I can. So if you turn select on while having that selected, you can't deselect it. So make sure that you control click it in your outliner to get rid of it first, and then go to selection mode. I mean, you could also just select your rig controls. It's not like oh no, you had it selected before you hit the button. You just select the rig control. But I'm kind of OCD about that. Anyways, the select button just makes it so that you for sure are only grabbing your control rig controls, and you're not able to grab any other assets or actors. So that's that button. And I'm going to go a little bit more specifically through some of the stuff in here, but I just want to point out there are some other things in this menu for space switching and constraints. There is a class in week 3. I will be teaching that one as well, and we will go over space switching and constraints instead of Unreal at that point. It is a wonderful system that they built for us here. It doesn't always work super well 100% of the time, but it works well enough that we can rely on it for a lot of stuff, and man, is it easy. But we're going to save that for future. For now, let's dive back to these animation tools. So that menu in the top right corner of this slide, these are what we're going to talk about for a second. If you use Animbot or other tools that your studio or third-party company has made in Maya, some of that stuff's just built in here in Unreal, which is super great. Let's go through some of them. There is a pose library built right in. The Control Rig Pose tool is that tool. I'm not going to go through using this too much right now. These GIFs will do it. There's documentation on it. We can talk about it in lab. I just want to show you that it exists. What you are able to do is if you make a bunch of hand poses, a body pose, a facial expression that you really like, you can save that and put it in your library so you can reuse it at any time. So you can organize them in folders, make little thumbnails so that you can always just see the preview of them. But the power of this is not just, cool, I can save it for later. It's that you can blend between them. So if you have happy and you have sad, or actually, let me use a better example. If you have shocked, surprised, and you have angry, you might want a combination of the two, where you want a character who's outraged. So what you can do is you can double click on your angry, and then you can click your surprise, and you can use a slider that is in here. You can see right here. It does it in the video somewhere around here. When you drag it, it'll drag and add the add or subtract the that transformation delta on those controls. Very, very helpful. And what's cool about that for the fellowship is that you guys can share your library poses with other people on your team. So if anybody is working on the same character or compatible meshes, like mannequins and things like that, you can, excuse me, you can sort of save a lot of time by collaboratively building a pose library for these characters. And then a common question is, can you save animations? I think at this point you can only save poses, but they're working on the functionality to, if I understand it right, I think they're working on the functionality to add saving animations into the library, but right now I believe it's just poses. 5.2. So that's what this slide is to talk about, that if you guys are using the same stuff, share your work. Now, obviously, you can still share animations. You can export your stuff as FBX or animation sequences or different things like that, and you can share those with each other. So you can migrate sequences to each other. You can share FBX data, and you can create libraries of animation, whether or not you're using the pose tool. And so this is where you start to get into the whole real-time collaboration thing. Is you can actually collaborate in real time by using these various features. And metahumans are all cross-compatible too. So if you do a facial expression with one metahuman and you want to move that to another metahuman, they are one-to-one, same system. That all works. Oh, and I guess just to show you, if you click on the poses button, there's your pose tool. But since mine is empty, that's why we stuck to the slide. It's not as exciting, but we can dive into that more in lab if you'd like. If I click the tweens button, I get this little guy. I could, oops, I could drag him. Woo. So there's your tween slider, which is your tween machine. It adds what it allow you. This one I can actually show you. What this will allow us to do is if we have, let's see, let's just use you. If I take this and I move your arm up, and it's going to drive me crazy that your shoulder looks like that. So let's go ahead and fix that. There you go. Definitely not the greatest interpolation I've ever done, but that's okay. So you're gonna let me do this? Whoa, that's F10. Nope, still not gonna let me do it. I think maybe it has something to do with the auto expand. No, it's just kind of glitched right now. That's okay. Anyways, what I can do though is if I grab the arm control where we have pose A and pose B. Oops. Pose A, pose B. A, B, A, B, A, B, right? If I look at my graph editor, you can see that I've got some data representing, whoa, there you go, representing pose A and pose B. And if I use my tween machine slider, or my tweens slider, of course I have it, if I go somewhere in the middle, what this allows me to do is I can drag this to create a key to favor either the left or right adjacent keys. By default, it wants to blend to neighbor. That's this little BN, blend to neighbor. If I drop this down, I've got push-pull, and I've got tween. I'll go to tween next, because it's kind of a easy next step. It's same thing, but this one allows me to overshoot a lot of the time. Right now, I'm not able to. Why can't I overshoot? Okay, so I can type in a value for this one. So I typed in a value of 2. -1 and +1 are 100% of the previous or next keyframe, but you can go beyond that bound here. Sometimes it lets me, there we go. If you hold control, it'll allow you to go up to plus or -2. So you can see I can overshoot. Overshoot the keys. So you can create some nice up and down. I'm not doing a good job of showing that. That's okay. So there's tween. So that the overshoot is in the tween mode. BN is blend to neighbor, because it'll blend to the neighboring keys. Oh, actually, suddenly it's letting me go beyond now. That's okay. Cool, great. And then push-pull. Push-pull is your amplify or de-amplify. So whatever the interpolation is doing, what this will allow you to do is say more or less of it. So if you had a bouncing ball, for example, going boo, 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 and your curve looks like this little bump, if you want it to just go higher, you can push that curve interpolation more in that direction it's already going, or pull it back away from whatever it's doing from your selection point. These are things we can dive into in lab. These are more kind of animation workflow stuff that they're good to know that they're here, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about them in class just because we have a lot of other features to talk about. But yes, so you have different modes of how this can work. So here you go. There's your little reminder for the PDF. Trails is your editable motion trail. If I have that animation with her arm doing its thing, I'll go ahead and grab the wrist. And if I grab the wrist and I say, if I say, give me the trails tool, it will pull up a little menu and I can say, show trails. And for anything that I have selected, maybe what I should do what I should do is this. I'm going to go ahead and take the trails and turn it off. I'm actually going to show you this on the running character. I think that will be more visually stimulating. Is if I take, let's take Manny. Let's take his animation. And actually, let's just do this. Let's just say bake to control rig, gimme, and create. There you go. All right, so we have all the animation data. So if I want to track his arcs of his wrist, I can say trails, show it to me, and that will show me. Key size is a little big, so I can dial that down. But I can now see the path through space that his arms are taking. I can adjust the thickness if that's a little too hard to see. And you've got various things in here you can do. You can mess with the color, you can mess with the thickness, the key size, things like that. You can also select multiple controls. Whatever you have selected, it will show you the path for those different selected things. So you can adjust these things. There's not quite as much functionality in this tool yet as there is in Maya. So in Maya, you have alternating keys where you can actually see your spacing. That's not a feature in here as far as I'm aware just yet. But you have the trails, and you can adjust the position of a thing by grabbing the points on the trail and moving them around. So yes, you can add keys. You can mess with the keys that exist in trails. So that is this. And then just keep in mind that if you like close that little menu that pops up without unchecking the box, the trails will still be there. So that might be useful, or you might be like, why are they not going away? Reopen it, uncheck the box, move on from there. The next one, this one is just magical. Pivot. This one, I'm just going to let the video show it to you. It's faster this way. This is your temp pivot tool from Anibot. It allows you to manipulate a control from somewhere other than where it wants to naturally bend at. So if you have a character place their hand on a wall and you want to do kind of like what the box did, right, where we had the proxy control, how it rolled up on its edges. If you have a character, press their hand on a surface and you want them to basically roll the hand up from the tips of the fingers, hopefully you can see on my camera. If you want to have that happen, that's a pain in the butt to have to like rotate, translate, and try to fake it. So what you can do is you can use the pivot tool, and it will allow you to create a point in space that you can then rotate any given control from that new pivot point. And it's going to put all the transformation data from that action on the actual control that's being used. So it'll still put all like the world space, or it'll still put all the data on the actual control, so you can still mess with it all you want. This using is pretty straightforward. There's two buttons, edit and pose, so I don't think I need to go much further than that. You will notice that I skipped one. I skipped one called Snapper, and that's because I'm going to save that for the constraint day when we have that class. We have a whole constraint thing, and this is really, really useful for that conversation. But just to mention it, there is a Snapper button that allows you to snap stuff on any number of frames. Again, spoilers. Okay. Now, we got to talk curve editor. This is your bread and butter, or at least this is my bread and butter. Some animators are less, most animators use the curve editor pretty religiously. If you're not an animator though, the curve editor might be a little daunting, and I totally understand that, but there's a few things in here that I want to show you that will make your life a bit easier. So, this is a collection of those things. You've seen how to get there. It's this big squiggly button. Big squiggly button. But what I would like to do is show you a few really useful buttons that you're going to need to know. And you have a whole class on curve editor, so I don't want to go too crazy into it, but I do want to spend some time showing you some useful things. So once again, curve editor button right there. When this is open, some things you're going to want to know. First up, top left corner of the curve editor, aside from the save button, is this, your curve view. In Maya, you know this is 1, 2, and 3, absolute, stacked, and relative view. You have that in Unreal. Hallelujah, hooray, best thing ever, love it. Absolute view gives you a standard like value graph where you have the values on the left and time on the right, and that's your way of doing things. And so all your curves are all here together, and that's great. But the problem is say you're animating the body and the face, and you have a character walking through space, and they walk 150 units in Y direction or whatever. 150 units doesn't sound like a lot, but on this graph you can see, if I zoom out, 150 is like all the way up here. So if I have one curve going all the way up there, and I have to be zoomed out enough to see everything, you can see that there's plenty of curves way in here that might be in like the 0 to 1, 0.5 even for like facial controls. Like, it's going to be impossible to see everything all at once. And so you have different modes. Stacked view is a really handy one, where it will separate every individual curve from each other so that you can see when in timing these various things are happening. This can really help separate and figure out why you might have an issue if something has like a weird hitch or pop to it, or if you're just working in cycles and you're trying to make sure things loop nicely. Whatever you're trying to do, this is a really good thing to know. And then there's normalized view mode, which will take all of the curves and have them take up the same amount of vertical space. It gets rid, both of the second and third option here, they both get rid of the value graph. Oops. Let me go ahead and switch that. There you go. They both get rid of the value graph. I think I have too many things selected. If it looks like this, select less things. Because here I have every single control on Manny selected, and every single control is also baked from his animation sequence. So maybe like don't look at everything all at once, and then it's not too bad. At least I don't think it looks too bad. But anyway, point being, absolute mode has it plotted on a value graph, and if you want to see everything bigger, normalized will do that. But again, you can't trust heights to any absolute scale. You have to just think of it relative to itself. So there's that. Oh, and yes, color coding is typically red for X, green for Y, blue for Z. Okay, so there's that, and that's super important that you know where those buttons are, because that's really helpful. You also have a variety of other things in here. We did kind of touch on this before, but I want to make sure we've really taken a second to look. You have a variety of other settings up here at the top of the screen. You've got different zoom stuff, different focus things. Cool. You might want to make some adjustments depending on your workflow if you're an animator. In the little visibility mode, there's different options for showing tangents. So if you want to see all tangents at all times, you can do that. Right now I actually don't have that set up. Let me do this and put it back to normal. If I take this animation data, this is a lot to look at because there's so many keys, but I'm going to go ahead and just do it anyway. If I say auto spline, I can now see that these are because it was baked data, they didn't have splines to speak of. But if I select these curves at the moment, now you can see that there is some tangent handles. The default behavior is to only show you tangent handles for the keys you have selected. If you would rather see them all the time, you can. You can switch it to say all tangents all the time. So just depending on your workflow, that's just good to know that's there. There's also snap time to selection. Some people might want this so that if you go to a key, it brings you to that key. So if I select this guy, it snaps me to that spot. So just depending on whether or not you want that, that is an option as well that you have in here. Snap time to selection, turn that off so I can go back to not doing that. And then there's buffer curves, which I want to bring up. So if I right click on a curve, you can buffer the curve. I think I will actually, let me do this. Give me 1 second. I'm realizing how overwhelming this might be for some people watching. And so I'm going to get rid of, I'll do this. I know what I'll do. Apologies for the delay. I wasn't planning on doing this, but I think it will be a little bit more helpful if I just do this. Add track, control rig, asset based, here you go. Just for the sake of those who aren't super used to looking at spline stuff, I'm going to try and make your life a little easier here. by not freaking you out. There. So just the one thing. Okay. So if I have this one curve selected, if I right click it and say buffer curve, what this will do is it will actually create a ghost after image of where that curve was. You won't see anything happen when you do buffer curves. Nothing will appear to have happened. But when you start to move it, you'll see where it was, which can be very, very helpful, especially if you are going to be cleaning up a lot of motion capture data, because you might want to say, hey, let me see what it started as. So as I make changes and clean it up and whatever, I can see how far away I'm going from that. And if I lose something, I know what to go back to. What's also very helpful about that is if I middle mouse, by the way, I told you in the hotkey section, I'd show you this later, middle mouse clicking on a curve creates a key on that curve. So that's a quick way to just go bloop, add a key to a specific curve and use middle mouse on it. But if I right click, you have your buffer curve. And then once you have a buffer curve in existence, you can swap them. So I can go whoop, and it'll swap back to what it was before. So I can say, hey, do I like the original, which looks like this? Or do I like the new stuff? So I can right click and say, swap back to my new version and say, wow, that's so much more interesting. I love it. I'm going to go ahead and say apply. Not apply, sorry. Apply will go back to the original, apparently. What you would do is you just buffer it again. And that will now buffer the new version of it. You can only have one buffer in memory at a time. I can move through these last slides pretty quickly. You've seen this. You can bake stuff, you go back and forth. Hooray. We've also mentioned this, the ability to add stuff. And this is, again, another thing that we're not going to touch into too much because you do have a whole class on additive animation. But you have the ability to set it as additive and as override. So you can set a new layer to take over entirely. Great. But we have a class on that. And then the last thing is to just kind of touch on some control rig stuff. Control rigs are the underlying controls for your characters. You don't have to build them. You can just use them. You can ignore all the fancy stuff inside of them, but they give you a lot of power. And this is that thing I mentioned earlier, that the mannequins have the ability to work with them. The mannequins have the ability to work with metahumans. And so the only thing I wanted to point out with these is that the mannequins have different control rigs inside of them. And we'll look at this more in lab specifically. But you'll see there are two examples here for the Quinn character. There's one with more controls that animators are going to usually want. But if you're newer to animation and you want to try the keyframe workflows, but that's a little daunting, there is a simpler version that's a little bit more kind of just click and drag, and it'll help pose the character a little bit more simply for you. And you can still bake to it and do all the normal things. And then I put the other two down here. There are 4 technically, but only 2 that you will actually animate. These other ones are for other blueprint related things that we're not going to cover in this fellowship. Your metahumans, I've already mentioned, you can make them on the web and you bring it in using Quixel Bridge. I put these in the slide so you have access to know, how do I get them in Unreal? You do it like this with the Quixel Bridge editor window inside of Unreal. And then that thing I mentioned before about the skeleton compatibility is that your Unreal 5 mannequins are compatible with Unreal 4. Sorry, the new mannequins from UE5 are compatible with the animations from UE4 stuff, but you just need to tell it, hey, you are actually compatible. Please use those other animation sequences, which you'll see in a later class as well. Same thing for metahumans, and that's why the animation sequence didn't immediately pop over, but you can tell it. And then the last thing here is that there are even more ways to animate than I've covered today, which there's a lot of options. You can IK retarget, which is going to be wonderful for using mocap data, even for non-human characters. If you want to crawl around in a motion capture suit, you can apply that to a non-bipedal character, and you can pick and choose what you want to have move over. Very, very powerful. Blueprints, you can do all kinds of stuff, which you have a class on that as well. And the last thing, which I do want to just mention to you, and this is the only other thing I'm going to show you, and then we'll definitely do this in lab, is keyframe recording. This is something that you can do in Blender, but you cannot do in Maya. So Maya animators, rejoice. There's a new workflow for you that is actually a lot of fun. Which actually, I guess I will show you this. I won't do it right now. We'll do it in the lab, but I do have it pre-prepped for you. I specifically made this in the 10-minute break that we took earlier. So this isn't in the files. I can share it with you separately. I'll put it in our crew files. But this little tiny this little tiny one mech and the big mech. If I hit play, all this animation, I did this in the 10-minute break that we were just kind of chilling while you guys had a coffee. And I used that by literally just taking, I have it here ready to go. I'll show you in the lab. Basically, you can grab a control, hit play, and move stuff around, and it will record the actions of what you're doing as long as you have auto key on. And then you can go and kind of layered, add stuff and add complexity. And you can just record stuff with your mouse or your stylus while it's playing, and it'll capture it. And you can clean it up, you can mess with it, use additive tracks, and so on. And you can get a lot of really cool stuff very quickly. And with that, hopefully you're ready to start playing around. Thank you all for your attention.